She thought her life was under control until she saw a document that changed everything. This wasn't just a contract, it was a trap she hadn't noticed. He, silently watching, showed her how she had been used from the very beginning. And now, when everything has come to light, she must make a choice. Is she ready for the truth that will shatter everything? Revenge and betrayal change everything. What comes next? CJ was sitting behind the wheel, his fingers gripping the leather steering wheel tightly. The lights of the city passed by outside, reflecting on the wet asphalt. The rain drummed gently on the windshield, creating a rhythm that should have been soothing, but instead, it only heightened his nervousness. In the passenger seat beside him sat Susan, his wife, his life partner for the past 9 years. She silently stared out the window, checking something on her phone. Every now and then, her lips would curl into a barely noticeable smile. CJ noticed, but he kept quiet. "Reading something interesting?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Susan quickly turned off the screen and threw the phone into her bag. "Just talking to Mom," she replied, not even turning her head toward him. CJ nodded, though doubts were beginning to creep into his mind. He knew his wife well, knew how she reacted when she was trying to hide something. But he just sighed and turned his gaze back to the road. The airport was empty that night. Only a few taxis were waiting for arriving passengers, and the terminal lights flickered in the rainy darkness. CJ stopped at the entrance and turned off the engine. "Well, here we are," he said, turning to his wife. Susan quickly opened the door and reached for the suitcase on the back seat. CJ followed her out, helping her retrieve the luggage. "Are you sure you want to fly alone?" he asked, once again trying to catch any hint of doubt in her voice. Susan smiled, but it seemed fake to him. "Yes, I told you. Mom and Dad want to spend time with me. You know how they worry." "I know," CJ replied, feeling a cold sensation pierce through him. He stood there, watching as she walked towards the entrance. Her stride was light, confident. She didn't even glance back. At that moment, he felt an invisible chasm opening between them. When she disappeared behind the terminal doors, CJ turned back to the car. But he didn't drive off immediately. He sat behind the wheel, staring ahead, his thoughts racing chaotically. Something wasn't right. Susan sat in first class, leaning back into the comfortable seat. She took a sip of champagne and finally allowed herself to relax. "Stop worrying," she heard a voice from beside her. She turned her head and saw a man sitting next to her. Tall, athletic, with confident manners. His eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Just tired," she replied, smiling. The man leaned in closer. "Is this your first time in Paris?" Susan glanced at him, her fingers lightly gliding over the stem of her glass. "No, but this time, I want to do things differently." The man smiled. "I think I can help." She didn't reply, but her smile said it all. The plane soared into the sky, and with it, something new stirred in her heart, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. At the same time, CJ received a message. "I hope you arrived safely. Love you." He glanced at the screen, then set the phone aside. He wanted to believe everything was fine, but something inside whispered, "You don't know the truth yet." CJ sat in the dark living room, holding a glass of whiskey in his hands. The clock on the wall showed 2 in the morning, but sleep still hadn't come. Thoughts of Susan kept him restless. He knew it was pointless, that he was just overthinking, but something inside kept him on edge. Her behavior in recent weeks had changed. She had become more distant, cold, as if her thoughts were somewhere far away. And now, this trip to Paris, her outright reluctance for him to go with her. Something didn't add up. He sighed and grabbed his phone. The last message from Susan was a few hours ago. "I hope you arrived safely. Love you." He hadn't replied. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know what to say. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but then he simply set the phone aside. Something about this trip was troubling him. Susan woke up to a light tap. The plane was already descending into Paris. She blinked, trying to focus, and then felt the warmth of a stranger's hand on hers. She turned her head and locked eyes with the man sitting next to her. His eyes sparkled with curiosity, and his lips curled into a barely perceptible smile. "Good morning," he said. She blinked again, recalling the events of the past few hours. They had talked, laughed, exchanged glances, and then she wasn't sure what had happened next. All she remembered was him offering another glass of champagne, and then everything went dark. Susan pulled her hand away and looked down. "We should get off," she said coldly, trying not to show her confusion. The man leaned closer. "It was nice meeting you, Susan." She didn't reply. She just stood up from her seat and quickly walked to the exit. The next morning, CJ still felt exhausted. He woke up late, and the first thing he did was check his phone. There were no messages from Susan. She hadn't even written to say she had arrived at her parents' house. That was strange. She usually always messaged. He unlocked his phone and opened the flight tracker app. Her plane had arrived on time, without any delays. So, she must have been at her parents' house by now. Why hadn't she written? CJ picked up the phone and dialed her number. The ringing went on for a while before he finally heard her voice. "Hello," she sounded sleepy, as if she'd just woken up. "I thought you'd message when you got there," he said, trying to sound calm. "Oh, sorry, I was just really tired. I barely made it to my parents and fell asleep right away." CJ frowned. "Are you sure you're at home?" A second of silence. "Yes, of course. Where else would I be?" It seemed like her voice was trembling, but maybe it was just his imagination. "I'm just checking," he said. "It's fine, don't worry," she tried to laugh, but it sounded forced. They talked a little longer, and CJ finally hung up. But the feeling of unease didn't go away. Something was wrong. Susan sat on the edge of the bed in the hotel room. She had told CJ the truth. She was really tired, but she couldn't tell him where she really was. She couldn't tell him she hadn't gone to her parents' house, but instead ended up in this room, with a man she barely knew. She ran her hand through her hair, trying to gather her thoughts. What had she done? The man from the plane, his name was Alex, was taking a shower now. She could hear the sound of water running in the bathroom, and she felt her heart race. Her phone lay on the desk, its screen dark. She knew CJ would call, and she knew she wouldn't be able to tell him the truth. Susan took a deep breath and walked over to the mirror. She looked at her reflection. She looked tired, but somewhere deep inside, she felt a strange sense of satisfaction. What if she hadn't stopped? What if this was just the beginning? A loud knock on the door made her jump. She turned around, her heart leaping into her throat. Who could it be? Susan froze. Another knock at the hotel door sounded, this time louder and more insistent. She glanced at the bathroom, where she could still hear the sound of water. Alex obviously hadn't heard. Her heart was pounding in her chest. Who could be looking for her? She hadn't told her parents or friends where she was. No one, except Alex, could know she was in this room. She slowly approached the door and peeked through the peephole. In the hallway stood a man in a dark suit. Tall, well-dressed, with a cold expression on his face. He looked like someone who didn't like waiting. "Mrs. Carlyle?" His voice was calm, but there was a firmness in it. Susan was confused. Her maiden name was Carlyle, but she hadn't used it in years. "Who are you?" she asked without opening the door. "My name wouldn't mean anything to you, but I'm here on business regarding your husband." The man paused briefly. "And Alex William." Everything inside her went cold. He knew about CJ and Alex? At that moment, the sound of water in the bathroom stopped. Alex was about to come out. "You've got the wrong room," she quickly said and stepped away from the door. The man knocked again, this time slower, almost threateningly. "Don't pretend you don't understand, Mrs. Carlyle. You'd better open the door, or the situation will become more complicated." Susan pressed her lips together. She couldn't let Alex see this man. It would be too suspicious. She understood that if she opened the door, she would get entangled in something bigger than a one-night fling. She inhaled and cracked the door just enough to see the man, but not enough for him to peer inside. "What is this about?" The man leaned closer, his eyes gleaming with cold confidence. "Your husband is concerned about you. He doesn't trust you, Mrs. Carlyle." And he was right. Susan tried to keep her breathing steady. "That's absurd. You think he won't figure it out? He's already started digging, and if he decides to find the truth, he'll find it." The man extended a business card to her. "I suggest you resolve this situation before it spirals out of control." Susan hesitated for only a second before abruptly slamming the door. She pressed her back against it, trying to process what she had just heard. Her heart was pounding wildly, but she didn't even have time to catch her breath before Alex's voice came from behind her. "Who was that, Susan?" Susan spun around sharply. Alex stood in the bathroom doorway, wrapped in a towel, his gaze tense. His wet hair hung over his forehead, and water droplets slowly trickled down his collarbones. He didn't look relaxed like he had just moments ago. On the contrary, his eyes flicked from her pale face to the closed door where the mysterious man had just disappeared. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, wiping his hair. Susan forced herself to exhale and rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain. Outside, by the hotel entrance, the man in the suit stood next to a black sedan, talking on the phone. She felt a wave of panic wash over her. "It was a hotel employee," she quickly replied, not taking her eyes off the car. "He said they accidentally mixed up the booking." Alex squinted but didn't argue. "Strange that you had to talk to him for so long," he muttered, grabbing a t-shirt from the dresser. Susan turned back to him. "I was just clarifying some details." She tried to sound calm, but her voice seemed too high-pitched. Alex noticed it, and his gaze became even sharper. "Is this about your husband?" Susan's heart skipped a beat. "What? Where did you get that idea?" Alex wiped his face with the towel and stepped closer. "I don't know, but you're acting strange, and I don't want your problems to cause me any." He stopped right in front of her, staring into her eyes. "You can say this is just a coincidence, but let's be honest. Something's not right here." Susan swallowed hard. She didn't know how to explain to him that Siggy was already starting to suspect something. And now, some stranger was telling her that her husband was conducting his own investigation. She wanted to believe the man was just bluffing, but something inside her told her otherwise. "I'll handle this myself," she finally said. Alex stared at her for a few more seconds, then shrugged. "I hope so, because if this backfires on me, we won't see each other again." Susan clenched her lips but didn't answer. She knew she had to act quickly. Siggy sat in his office, staring at his laptop. On the screen was the airline page, where he saw the details of Susan's flight. She was supposed to arrive yesterday, but since then, no photos, no video calls, just dry messages that could be sent from anywhere. He opened his phone and checked the location tracking app he had secretly installed on her phone a month ago. He didn't like spying on his wife, but something had pushed him to do it. However, this time, the location was turned off. Siggy clenched his fists. He opened their joint bank account and began reviewing the transactions. Le Grand Luxe Hotel. Payment at a restaurant in central Paris. Another payment at a bar. He stopped at the last entry. Hotel? Siggy leaned back in his chair. She wasn't staying at her parents'. She had lied to him. He clenched his jaw. He needed more information. Susan stood by the window, holding her phone in her hands. She knew she needed to write to Siggy to calm him down, but the words caught in her throat. Her attention was drawn to a movement below. The black sedan was still there. The man in the suit was now sitting in the car but not moving. He was waiting. She held her breath. At that moment, the phone vibrated. A message from Siggy. "How's everything?" She didn't know how to respond, but she knew one thing. Siggy wouldn't stop. He would find out the truth. And what if he already knew? Susan stared at the phone screen, feeling her fingers tremble. The message from Siggy was short, almost casual, but she knew there was more behind it. His question sounded too simple, too calm. If he didn't suspect anything, he would have just asked something routine, maybe about her parents, or if she remembered to take her vitamins, like he always reminded her. But this was different. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "All good. Just relaxing, and you?" She hit send, and immediately felt a wave of unease. A few seconds later, the phone vibrated again. "I'm good. I'd like to video chat. Can you now?" Susan bit her lip. She couldn't talk right now. She wasn't in her parents' living room. She was in an expensive hotel room, and if Siggy saw that, he would immediately know she was lying. She quickly typed a reply. "Bad connection here. Better later." She stopped, thought for a moment, and added another sentence to distract him. "How's our house? Did you remember to water the flowers?" The phone was silent for a few minutes, and she almost thought he accepted her answer, but then another message came through. "I'll check them tomorrow." By the way, I was thinking of surprising you. You know, I haven't seen your parents in a while. What do you think, if I come to Paris for the weekend, will they be happy? The blood drained from her face. He did it on purpose. He knew. Susan slowly lowered the phone onto the table and leaned her hands on its cold surface. She felt panic spread under her skin. If he came, it would all be over. She remembered the man in the suit, his words about CJ conducting an investigation. So it was true. He already suspected her. Maybe he even knew. What should she do? A sharp knock on the door made her jump. Susan glanced at the clock. Alex hadn't returned from the bar yet. So who could it be? She walked to the door and pressed her eye to the peephole. It was the same man in the suit. He hadn't left. Susan felt everything inside her tighten. He raised his hand and knocked again, this time patiently but firmly. She knew she couldn't hide forever. Sighing, she slowly opened the door. Back again? Her voice was firm, though panic raged inside. The man scrutinized her with a gaze, as if measuring how much longer she could hold up. I warned you, Mrs. Carlyle. You're running out of time. Susan gritted her teeth. What do you want? To help you. His voice was even, almost indifferent. Why should I trust you? The man tilted his head slightly. Because I know what comes next. And believe me, you won't like it. He took a step closer, making her retreat. If you think CJ will just sit quietly and wait, you're underestimating him. He's already taking action. Susan clenched her fingers into a fist. What do you mean? The man pulled out his phone and, without saying a word, showed her a photo. Susan felt her breath catch. It was CJ. He was standing in the lobby of this very hotel. She looked up sharply at the man. Is this today? He nodded. He's already here. Susan swayed. Her husband had come to Paris, and he was looking for her. Susan felt the floor beneath her seem to sway. She stared at her phone screen, unable to believe her own eyes. CJ was here. In the same hotel. Her mind was spinning. How? When did he manage to arrive? He hadn't said he'd really do it. She thought his message was just a provocation, an attempt to make her open up. But no, he was already acting. She looked up at the man in the suit, who was still holding the phone in front of her face. Does he know? Not yet. The man calmly put the phone back in his pocket. But if you don't start acting, he'll know very soon. A chill ran down Susan's spine. She couldn't let CJ see her here. If he found her, if he learned the truth, everything would be over. She took a deep breath and ran a hand through her hair. Why are you helping me? The man smiled slightly. I'm not helping you. I'm just doing my job. Susan narrowed her eyes. And what kind of job is that? He leaned in a little closer. Let's say there are people who benefit from your husband not getting certain information. She stared at him, confused. What does that mean? It means that there are more secrets in your life than you think, Mrs. Carlyle. She didn't have time to answer because she suddenly heard the elevator doors open in the hallway. The man threw a quick glance over her shoulder and quickly stepped back. We better not see each other again, he said quietly. But remember, if you're not careful, this will end badly. Susan wanted to say something, but he had already disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. She stood by the door, her heart racing. And then she saw him. CJ. He was stepping out of the elevator, scanning the hotel lobby. His eyes were cold, focused. He was looking for her. Alex swallowed whiskey in large gulps, staring at his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. The thought was spinning in his head. He had gotten too caught up with this woman. At first, it was just fun. A chance meeting on a plane. A game of temptation, flirting. But now, it had become more complicated. He knew that Susan was hiding something. She was too tense, too scared. And the worst part, he had started getting attached. Alex sighed and took out his phone. His finger hovered over the screen. A message from Kate. Where are you? Why aren't you answering? He pressed his lips together. He knew he shouldn't have come here. Kate was his fiancée. They were supposed to get married in 2 months. But now he was sitting in a Parisian bar, far from home, and thinking not about her, but about another woman. About a woman who might be ruining her life right now. He knew he should leave. Go back to the room, tell Susan it was a mistake, that it was over. But instead, He dialed a number. Kate picked up almost immediately. Alex? Where the hell are you? He leaned back and took a sip of whiskey. I'm in Paris. What? He imagined Kate squeezing the phone in her hand. What are you doing in Paris? Alex closed his eyes. I made a mistake. Silence filled the line. And then Kate said, It's because of her, right? Alex didn't answer. He didn't want to lie. Listen, you need to come back. Her voice trembled. Alex, this isn't like you. He sighed. I know. Then why are you doing this? He looked at himself in the mirror. Because I'm afraid that if I leave now, I'll never know the truth. Kate exhaled. Alex. I'll call you back, he said and hung up. He lifted his head and saw CJ. He was standing by the entrance to the bar, and he was staring directly at him. Susan lurked in the shadows, watching as CJ moved down the hall. She could feel her heart pounding wildly in her chest. What was he going to do? He stopped by the front desk, asked something, but the staff member shook his head. He still didn't know her number. She had a few minutes to decide what to do next. And then she saw him. Alex. He stepped out of the bar and bumped into CJ. Her lungs tightened. They stared at each other. If Alex says something now, Susan understood that it would be over. She held her breath, and CJ took the first step toward him. CJ slowly approached Alex, his eyes cold and alert. Alex didn't move, only pressed his lips together, observing him carefully. The tension hung in the air. Susan could feel her heart racing. She knew she had to act, but she couldn't make herself move. All she could do was watch as the two men, caught between each other, stood face to face, ready for the inevitable clash. Are you Alex Williams? CJ asked calmly, his voice quiet but firm. Alex raised an eyebrow. And you are? CJ, he replied. Susan's husband. The words hung between them like the edge of a knife. Alex sighed and set his whiskey glass down on the bar. And what do you want? CJ took another step closer. I want to know why my wife stopped at a hotel and not at her parents' place. Alex looked at him with slight surprise, then smiled, but there was no amusement in his eyes. Oh, she didn't tell you? CJ tensed. What didn't she tell me? Alex paused for a moment, as if weighing what to say. Then he leaned a little closer. Do you really want to know? CJ felt his fist clenching. Say it. Alex slowly turned, grabbed his phone from the table, unlocked the screen, and scrolled through messages for a few seconds. Then he turned it towards CJ. CJ stared at the screen. It was a photo. His wife. Susan in the same room where she was hiding now. She was sitting on the bed in just a towel, with Alex standing beside her, relaxed, smiling. CJ's blood ran cold. This? His voice was barely audible. Yes, Alex nodded. It's exactly what you think. CJ felt a storm rising inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. Did she tell you she's married? Alex shrugged. We met on a plane. She didn't mention you. Of course she didn't, CJ whispered. He stepped back a little, trying to process what he'd just seen. He suspected her. He was gathering evidence. But seeing it with his own eyes was something completely different. Alex shoved the phone back into his pocket. What are you going to do? CJ lifted his gaze. I'll find out the whole truth. And he walked away. Alex watched him go, then exhaled. He felt a slight twinge of guilt, but he knew he'd done the right thing. But he didn't even suspect that things were about to get much more complicated. Susan stood by the window, her hands trembling. She had seen everything. She had seen Alex show something on his phone. She knew it was a photo. CJ knows. She abruptly turned away from the window and began pacing the room. What should she do? She pulled out her phone and dialed Alex. What have you done? She hissed as soon as he picked up. He had the right to know, Alex replied calmly. You've ruined everything. No, Susan, you did. She gritted her teeth. What did he say? He wants to know the whole truth. Everything went dark in front of her eyes. This isn't over, she whispered. You're right, Alex agreed. This is just the beginning. He hung up. Susan stood in the middle of the room, her heart pounding like mad. She knew she had to act. If CJ finds out more than he should, it's over for her. She took a deep breath and dialed another number. The phone rang for a long time. Then a woman's voice answered. I knew you'd call. Susan clenched her lips. I'm in trouble, Kate. A brief sigh came from the other end. Of course you are. Susan closed her eyes. I know you want him to find out. Oh, Susan, Kate laughed. He already knows. Susan opened her eyes. What? Alex told me everything. Susan felt everything inside her tighten. Why did you do it? Kate exhaled. Because I was tired of waiting. Waiting for what? The moment when everything falls apart. Susan froze. Kate, he will find out the truth. About everything. You don't understand. No, Susan, it's you who doesn't understand. There was a brief click on the phone. She threw the phone on the bed and covered her face with her hands. Everything was falling apart, and she didn't know if she could stop it, because now Kate was in the game, and Kate wanted revenge. Susan felt her heart freeze for a moment as Kate hung up. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, holding the phone in her hand as if it were her last lifeline. Now she knew that all that was left was to watch her world crumble, and that process was getting closer with every passing second. Alex was definitely not someone she had planned to have in her life. He was just a coincidence, nothing more than a nightmare that overshadowed her marriage. But there was something in his eyes that made her lose the most important thing, control. He was not like other men. His gravity was stronger. She felt it the moment their eyes first met. Now, when everything was in full swing, Susan could no longer stop what she had started. She sat on the edge of the bed, took a deep breath, and dialed Kate's number again. This time, Kate answered loudly. She was not only ominous, she was clear. She was no longer afraid to play the role of a leader. She knew what she wanted, and she wouldn't stop. Susan's answer no longer mattered to Kate. Kate wanted everything to fall apart. But by that point, the situation no longer depended on Kate. Susan raised her head. Her gaze fell on the large mirrored table in front of her. She saw herself, still in her pajamas, sitting there, confused. Her hands were trembling. She didn't know what to do next. She was caught in the situation, but had neither the strength nor the ideas to stop it all. The feeling was stronger than ever before, and it felt like a farewell to the reality she knew up until that moment. She threw off her pajamas and left the room. She had to talk to Sid, no matter how hard it was. She had to express everything that had built up. She needed to explain. But when she stepped into the hallway, her eyes fell on the very scene she herself could not forget. Sid was standing by the window, looking out at the street. His back was straight, and his gaze seemed stone cold, focused on something invisible to her. He looked as though he had already made the final decision. Sid, she quietly called to him. He turned. His eyes were cold, but there was pain in them, pain she had never seen in his gaze before. He said nothing, just stared at her. I know everything, he said, his voice calm, but with a heavy exhaustion in it. And you know it. Susan felt her heart start to race. She walked up to him and took his hand, though he immediately pushed her away. It was a gesture she didn't like. I'm sorry, she began, but his gaze made her fall silent. Do you want me to understand? Or do you just want an apology? Susan felt the words leave her. She didn't know how to explain it. She knew all the words would be irrelevant now. In her mind, there was only one question. How to stop this storm that was gathering momentum. But at that moment, her phone rang. Susan glanced at the screen and saw Kate's name. She felt her heart skip a beat. Without thinking, she pressed the button and answered. You have to decide, Susan. Kate's voice was calm, but there was an irreversible determination in it. You won't be able to stop what's happened. Maybe you don't even want to. Kate, you're interfering again, Susan said, her voice barely audible, but firm. You have no right. Oh, I have more right than you think, Kate coldly replied. You won't even notice how all of this ends, but I will. I'll be watching. Susan couldn't take it anymore. She threw the phone to the floor and scanned the room with her eyes. Could she fix all of this? Sid walked up to her, his eyes now much softer, though still full of pain. You've ruined everything, Susan, he whispered. You know that? She nodded. She knew. And now, when everything had gone this far, she had no more chances. Maybe so, she whispered, her gaze dropping. Then she heard a knock on the door. She jumped, and Sid flinched too. Someone entered the room. Susan saw a man who wasn't part of her world. He stood in the doorway, looking directly at Sid. It was Alex. He was calm, even imperceptibly carefree. He didn't look like someone who was part of this struggle, but he was the very person they both had tried to avoid. "What are you doing here?" Sid asked, his voice not as calm as before. Alex smiled, and his smile was very cold. "I could say I'm just taking what belongs to me," he said. "And maybe right now, both of you will find out what truly matters in this situation." Alex stood in the doorway, his gaze cold and impassive, as if he had long known what was going to happen next. Susan couldn't say why he made her feel so hopeless, but it was like a premonition of an approaching storm. Her heart beat faster, and the moment seemed too real to ignore. "Did you come to break the last thing left?" Sid asked, his voice now not calm. It was anger mixed with disappointment. Alex shrugged, his smile still as cold. "I didn't come to destroy. I came to finish what started a long time ago. You both became part of this, whether you wanted to or not." Susan felt it hard to breathe. She clenched her fists, trying to come up with some explanation, although she knew that everything had long since gotten out of control. Now, standing before her were two men she had once loved, but between them swirled only dark malice and unforgiveness. "You think this is it?" Sid laughed, but his laughter was empty, without joy. "All you're doing is watching us destroy each other." Alex didn't answer, but his gaze was so determined that Susan couldn't help but notice that he knew more than they imagined. "Do you have a plan?" she asked, trying to stay calm. She wanted to control at least some part of this situation. Alex nodded, without looking at her, and took a step forward. He approached the table and picked up a few papers that were lying next to the phone. They were documents that Susan didn't recognize, but their presence was so unusual that she felt her heart skip a beat again. "This is what I want." Alex placed the documents in front of them. "These documents will change everything you thought you knew about yourself. These aren't just pieces of paper. This is a contract, signed by both of you. And here it is, right in front of you." Susan looked at the documents, and something inside her froze. She didn't remember signing anything like this, but the context was different. This was something bigger. This wasn't just her marriage. This was something that threatened everything. "You want us to sign this now?" CJ asked, his voice calm again, but there was an underlying tension in it. Without answering, Alex turned to Susan and looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. "Susan, do you really not understand what's happening? You've been part of this game from the very beginning. You thought you could just stop it like pressing a button, but it's not that simple." Susan felt her vision blur. She had the sense that her life was now hanging by a thread, and all that was left was to uncover the truth they had been hiding from her. One step, and she wouldn't be able to go back. "What game is this?" she asked. "And why didn't you tell me this earlier?" Alex smiled, but it wasn't a smile of joy, rather one of bitter realization. "Because it wasn't your decision, Susan. You were just a piece on the chessboard, where others played. You thought everything was under control, but in reality, it was just a matter of time." And that's when she understood. All these years with Sid J, building their life together, it hadn't been a coincidence. It was part of a bigger plan unfolding around her. And now, as she tried to stop it, her steps no longer mattered. She was trapped. Alex took another step forward, his voice now sounding even more decisive. "You want to know the truth? I'll give you the truth. But are you ready to hear it?" Susan didn't answer, but her eyes were filled with helplessness and fear. Alex turned to Sid J. "These documents aren't just a contract. This is an alliance you didn't expect. You think you've lost everything, but in reality, you're just now realizing how much you've been used." Sid J froze. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You're talking about this like we were part of something bigger," he said, still not believing it. "How can this be true?" Alex looked up, and his eyes seemed to become clearer. He watched as Sid J and Susan realized that nothing in their lives had been what it seemed. "This isn't just revenge. This is the realization of a plan that was set in motion long before you met her, Sid J. She's been part of it from the very start. Now you both understand who truly holds the cards. And it's not you." The whole room fell silent. Susan felt her heart grow heavy, as everything she thought she knew fell apart before her eyes. Now you know who really controls your fate. You were just pieces in someone else's game, Alex said. And now, Susan, it's your turn to make a choice. What would you do if you found out your wife was cheating, and you were caught between two men who knew more than you?